All right, welcome everybody. We've got another show today, and we've got some great topics to talk about. Basically, talking about how our members are pivoting with all the changes that are going on from a regulatory environment, from their customers, and so forth. But I'm joined here by Suzanne and Andy. And hey, guys.
Hi, Alex.
Hello.
Hi, Suzanne.
And why don't we go ahead and start first with CSRA updates, what's happened over the past weeks, things to look for, Suzanne. Let's start with you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody from the East Coast, and I think it's afternoon for everybody. Big week here. We had Michigan open up outdoor dining. They were closed for a while, so we're starting to see things open up. That was one example. Other states are starting to see their numbers drop, so they're anticipating expanding indoor dining. So it's really exciting to see vaccines happening and what that means to the counts in this crazy pandemic. There's also been some really good news on some things like cocktails to go, which were kind of unheard of before the pandemic, and that's happening in between 20 and 30 states. That's allowable, and a really great opportunity for restaurants to continue to serve and keep their customers happy. So that's been great. And there's a lot happening at the federal level as well this week. Congress voting until 6, I think, this morning, the Senate. So a lot of action going on.
Right. What's the tone of the membership over this past week? Has it been hopeful? Has it been pessimistic? What would you have the kind of the pulse of the country at your fingertips, Suzanne. What are people feeling and thinking at this point?
I would say hopeful. We have a great opportunity to talk with our various staff levels at the beginning of the month, and we talk with membership, business development, and communication staff, and everybody's planning for 2021 and what that means. People are planning on in-person events again and opening up and knowing that they can be together with their members. In the meantime, they're being creative now with online options and some outreach via virtual events, but knowing that we're going to come back to some normalcy, the new normal, I think second quarter of the year. And still, the other thing that's really phenomenal and fascinating out there is we're seeing membership growth continuing because the restaurateurs, the amount of advocacy that the National Restaurant Association does at the national level and what the states are doing at the local level as legislative sessions start out around the country in this first quarter of the year.
Great. Andy, from a supplier perspective, how's the tone from individual restaurants? I know that we've just recently in Washington State institute 25% depending on the region that you're in. How have folks been taking that?
They're excited about it, but excited with that degree of caution that you would expect after this past year. That here in Washington, we have switched to a 4-factor qualifying grid. So there's 4 transmission factors that are being under consideration, and rather than going county by county, we're doing what you could call a county cluster. And for the first couple of weeks that we were doing that, nobody was qualifying. And so our governor lowered the threshold, and that put our most populous county clusters back into 25%. So on one hand, operators would have loved to have a little more planning period of time than just a few days to get orders and scheduling going. But on the other hand, there's a big sigh of relief with that aspect of caution that what if, say, Super Bowl and new variants spread the containment factor or contagious factor outside and they disqualify again. I think that operators are happy for this opportunity, but they're nervous for going back to getting shut down again.
Now, Suzanne, I know that it might be different here in Washington State versus other parts of the country. But here, there's a concern from restaurateurs that they'll go into 25%. So they get their staff together, they get their food orders in, and then 2 weeks later, they might go back. Is that something that you're seeing across the country, or is this something that's kind of regionalized depending on the state that you're in?
It's somewhat regional. However, when we first started to have some closures last year, that happened with some states in particular had the go ahead, purchased inventory, and then had a quick shutdown. And so the state restaurant associations were able to step in some cases, some funding to support the losses there. I think now it was such a shock when this thing first happened, and people are a little more attuned to tracking the numbers. I think some of us are experts now in tracking this, and our response rate, or our positivity rate, that sort of thing. So we all have our pulse, our finger on that pulse a little bit better and deeper now, and we're able to track it. And there's, I think, as I mentioned, the advocacy that happens at the state level. Also, those states are in really good and open conversations with their governors and their governors' staff, so they have an idea of what's coming up down the road.
Right. And from a supplier's perspective, how do you navigate? How does a company like you navigate when a restaurant could all of a sudden put in a $10,000 food order and then next no orders at all? I mean, that's from a cash flow, from a business operations perspective, that could be kind of troubling, right?
Yeah, it's not. It even goes deeper than that into the logistics. So, traditionally for a broadline or any distributor, you have to kind of be able to read some data and some historical metric points from weeks ago to figure out where you're going to be weeks from now, just to get product from inception to a table. And so it makes it really hard. It's not like running to the corner grocery store to get the kind of volume you need to set up your restaurant. And so for distributors all over the place, and this goes all the way back to the farms, that how many things do I even plant with food service so disrupted? So it's just one of those things that everybody is having to kind of figure out what to do. It's okay. Before we get too far away from it, Susanna mentioned something that I'm starting to see a parallel to. You had said that, Suzanne, you're seeing a rise in membership. Mm-hmm. You're saying that's due to the advocacy that people are seeing, and so they're feeling the weight and the services of an association more profoundly now than they did before.
Correct. They're seeing it in action. They knew what the state restaurant associations did and offered, but they're seeing them at the state level and the national level as well. But the state level, what that advocacy means, what they've done to talk with the governors, and what that state restaurant association's relationship means, and they see the immediate impact for their restaurants. Look at we're up there arguing for you guys to be open to 50%, and to advocate for showing that mask use works and helps us to be able to be open at 50%. And so they're seeing what's going on there, and a number of states have had more members joining and different companies, and so they're seeing the value.
Yeah, what stood out to me is that a trend that I'm seeing coming in full force and really out of almost nowhere. On my primary role is as a consultant, and I've had this sharp pivot from operational catch up to housekeeping. It's almost like all of a sudden, I think part of it is PPP loans. The first draft is about to expire, and there's another one coming in. And so I am just spending so much time counseling people on how to select a better point of sale system or a better inventory management technology. And so I wonder if you're seeing that with your business development teams on the state restaurant association times with the allied communities. Lex, Suzanne, are you seeing that too?
Absolutely. And that came up on one of our calls today this week. There's more PPP money coming out. That always means more activity at the states. It's directly proportional. Lex, are you seeing that as well, or?
Absolutely. I think there's those resources are giving members an opportunity to look at their business in ways they haven't before. And so I think that's providing a unique growth opportunity, I guess, if for lack of a better term, right?
Yep.
Right. I think that one of the benefits of COVID has been once the urgency and the stress of it has kind of settled into the background, it's created enough slow awareness that people are starting to not only look at their business from a more holistic standpoint for what it is, rather than what they have always historically perceived it to be, but I think they're also seeing how one thing connects to another in richer, more relevant ways, which is what connected my experience as a consultant to what you just said about a rise in membership, that perhaps people are starting to see in a real way what the relationship nexus state restaurant association can be for an operator.
True.
We're and plus it can't take the efforts away from a lot of it's been a challenging time for a lot of the sales or the member relations team, if you will, for these different associations, and they've had to pivot as well, if they even still have their positions, right? I mean, it's been a very tough year. So what we're finding here is, the team has really been going out and knocking on doors, not figuratively, and talking to them individually. And we're finding that personal touch goes a lot further these days than perhaps before, when they were meeting with suppliers on a daily basis. Now, I know in our office here, it's just maybe a handful of people for a building that usually houses 50 people, right? And I could imagine in a restaurant that could be rather lonely. So I think that personal touch is starting to resonate, and I think that's helping drive member value with folks.
Yeah, there's also sort of that aspect of grief counseling. It's good to have someone to talk to that gets it, that can also help provide perspective and maybe talk to other operators that you don't, to make those people feel less alone. And I can see where someone in a membership capacity at a restaurant association would be able to provide that.
Yeah, I think one of the other things too that we need to look at is, how do associations pivot when the cycle changes so quickly, right? I mean, in this state, it can go from 25%, it can go back to 0%, it can go to 50%. It could also be based on growing trends, ghost kitchens, all these things. All these things are affecting our members all at once. And how does an association navigate through that? And how do they communicate on that premise, right? And so we're having to evolve our social media strategy on a daily basis. We're doing more videos and webinars, and we're constantly pivoting. We had our hill climb recently, our legislative event. It was all virtual. We had over 130 people attend that. It was actually one of our best attended hill climbs in history, but it was all virtual. And so it was, there's a lot of these things that folks have to navigate through. Suzanne, what have you seen from some of the associations out there, both large and small, and how they're responding to all these really ongoing changes?
I would say they're nimble, and we talked about on one call, what does your social media plan look like? And these were top-notch professionals, and they're like, are you, okay, I have a plan, and then your day starts and something happens and you pivot. So they're creative, they're smart, so they know how to promote and work with their membership. But it's things are changing so quickly. Like Lex, we talked about the PPP thing, but you've got new vendors out there that maybe you do a webinar with them and with that product, and it speaks to your membership. Remember I think it was March or April when this first unfolded last year, and I saw the resiliency of the industry when we started talking about different opportunities for carryout and working with selling pantry items out of restaurants. And so what you saw was restaurant associations immediately talking with their restaurant operators who could do these pantry, basically sell groceries from their stores as well as from their restaurants as well. So what that meant is at the state restaurant association level, they're working with their operators and the operators' vendors, and it was a win-win for everybody. The consumers still had product, the restaurants were making money, the vendors were making money because their products were being sold in a different mode. But I just think the pivot is so overused, but it's the reality of what happened and that nimbleness. And then the other thing I would say is, Lex, you talked about the building, the 50 employees, and you're down to 3 and everybody's online, but what I've seen at the States is you're wearing a couple different hats. If you were membership before, you're membership, and you're also probably sales because in a different way, because you're serving those members and reaching out to them and being that provided that trusted counselor and that advisor on what's happening and what the state is doing for them, and as they look at partitions and building tents, or you've seen a lot of the igloos, or how we deal with expanded outdoor dining. And so there's so many ways that the restaurant association staff are helping to educate members and help them pivot. My favorite word.
That's what restaurants are having to do too. They're having to do more with less. Some people, they just haven't been able to even staff up enough to start bringing back a front of house personnel in a real way. And so they've got cooks greeting tables at times. They're switching to counter service. So that associations are doing that also. That everybody has to wear different hats. It's just a state of the industry that we're in. It just has rippling effects outwards, doesn't it?
It does, but it shows you what a strong industry. It was a challenging time in March of last year when everything closed. I was so happy when I was on that first webinar on grocer rents. I was like, what a smart and nimble industry. It felt great to see.
Yeah, we're resilient, aren't we?
Yes.
Yeah. So we had a board meeting recently, and one of the breakout groups that we had was talking about how they now accept information in, because email is really important, because social media increases important, web increases important. All these things are increasing in importance because you no longer can just drive over to the place and shake their hands and have a cup of coffee with them, and not yet anyway. And so the board is getting information differently, and we found that there's a challenge in email deliverability. Even though our numbers say that they're getting the emails, they say they don't see the emails. We also talk about the different challenges of everybody thinks everybody's on Facebook. That's not the truth. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are not on Facebook. A lot of people are on Instagram only, or Twitter, or Reddit, or some other thing. And so navigating through that. So with all of that in consideration, for a question for both of you, how does a association decide the best ways to communicate with their members when it's drastically evolving on a regular basis?
Sure, I can jump in here, Andy, if you don't mind, because we had a good conversation about that this week. You talked about the various social media outlets, Lex, and of course our states use all of those. One state in particular has a phenomenal following on LinkedIn, and that's where most of their traffic comes. And I think you know your audience, number one, but we're all being flooded in our emails, and I think everybody recognizes that. We talked about open rates, and for a while there, when I think the restaurants were shut down a little bit, the open rate was significantly higher, or the read rate from emails. That's backed off. So they're getting creative with these other ways with LinkedIn. Also, I think it's important to go across all platforms as you're hitting those demographics. Some people like Facebook, some people are TikTok. I mean, it just depends. And I think Instagram, I would say Instagram, when I'm following the state restaurant associations, that's where I see the most traffic. But again, like I mentioned, that one has that strong presence on LinkedIn. So you find what works for you, and or you increase that social media outlet use.
I had an interesting call from, so I'm the resident restaurant consultant for a broadline distributor. And so I get a lot of outreach from our sales reps, and an older fella had called up and he was talking about, I don't know how to connect with some of my younger customers, and how do I do it? And it all seemed like this big mystical thing, but it really comes down to the essence of communication is you need to understand how people want to be communicated with first in order to even get the conversation started. And so when you talk about experimenting with all of your social media platforms or communications platforms, I absolutely believe that you should, but it should be done intentionally so that you are looking at what is resonating so you can pivot and lean towards that. And one thing I haven't heard was the good old-fashioned phone call. You know, a lot of attention gets placed on the new shiny thing, and the youngest generation that is making all of these changes that make people more settled in their ways nervous. But there's still a lot of people in that Gen X and Boomer and traditionalist mentality that still value a phone call, or still value the organic nature of communication, and they like to see it replicated on these digital formats.
Yeah, I think our membership team has been really active with that. Again, just having a shoulder to cry on, having being a resource, because we are putting out so many articles on a daily basis with the association. They almost play a role of curator, right? I mean, you know, we have hundreds of articles on our resource hub, and if a member needs to know about something related to PPP, well, maybe we just had a webinar recently with somebody, and they could direct them to that. So there's a lot of, all of a sudden, communicating with our members isn't just communications, it's the whole team.
Yeah, you know, you just brought up something, Lex, because, and we've kind of touched on this throughout this whole conversation, but these sands are just ever shifting. And so, like I just said, we just shifted to a new way of tracking how open our industries are going to be. And it was like the third iteration of how we track these sorts of things. And so when people are looking for current information, there are some changes and nuance in what you've produced, say, 6 months ago, that could steer someone in a completely wrong direction. So it must be quite a challenge for a lot of restaurant associations or hospitality associations to keep the most current and most relevant information up front, so people aren't finding the old things the same way that somebody might download a menu from a restaurant that's 10 years old. How do you do that?
Well, we have to delete and update and archive. I think I've got one member of my team that's a big part of what he does, is just archive a lot of the old information, because if you have PPP information and you don't designate this was PPP 1 back last spring versus the one now, people can get confused and people can take the wrong action. So you really have to be a good steward of the information with our members. And now using the other side of that is because it's also allowed us to maybe jumpstart some content pieces because we have already written on them. And again, PPP is a good example on that. There were some deltas in this time around with PPP, but there were a lot of consistencies as well. So it allowed us to recycle and basically refresh that content, where, you know, instead of writing a 600-word piece or a 1,000-word piece, we only have to write 300 words and do a little bit of fact checking and updating of links, which is a lot easier to navigate through as opposed to doing something from scratch. So, so that's, you know, that's the way you have to look at it. But it's a constant daily grind. You can't not stop. You can't stop because there's always something new at the state level, at the local level. And that's where it can get really confusing, because we have members at the local level and there's local assistance packages, there's local regulations. And fortunately for us, we have a great local government affairs team and a communications team that we work with. But I don't think a lot of associations have that flexibility, Suzanne. I mean, most folks don't have a local government affairs team to work with.
Agree. You've got a robust staff there. That's why this wearing of many hats. I would say sometimes the CEO and one staff person that does government affairs, and they're covering the state. But I do want to talk about a couple things. Like I've noticed a state or two that puts in their newsletter, pay attention. This is the truth as we know it as of today, or not the truth, but the information that we know as of today. And there's a lot of information management going on. So it's key.
Yeah, Lex, what advice would you have for a restaurant association that just doesn't have the resources to have a team, even a fraction of your size, to keep this information relevant and out front? What kind of housekeeping would you recommend for them to maybe put that information genie back in the bottle?
Let's say you're a staff of one, which unfortunately I think there's a lot of restaurant associations out there that it's a staff of one. A lot of chambers of commerce out there that are staff of one. And so let's start from there, because then you can build out. My whole thing is, as always, as you both know, I'm really into trying to repurpose and maximizing the content that you use, and trying to make it look like the work of one person is the work of 10 people. And I think we've been able to do that where focus on the quality first of all. So let's say you want to get an information piece out to your members on the PPP, and you want to provide guidance because that is the single most important thing to your members at this point. Next week it might be different. Next week it might be, how do you respond to the governor's new proclamation that you have to do this, that, or the other thing? If you're only a staff of one, you have to really place a lot of emphasis on prioritizing the single most important piece of information that your members need to receive now. And then focus your efforts on creating that piece, whether that's a webinar, whether that's an article. I would say if you're a staff of one, go with a webinar because, let's say you do a 35 1-hour-long webinar and you have an industry expert on, which you could probably get, and then you're there as the moderator as well as contributing, and maybe you have a couple of other members on, and you have a 1-hour-long session talking about assistance packages from the most recent round of PPP relief packages out there. Then you could then either outsource that, because again, you're staff of one, you could outsource it, you could try to do it yourself. My guess is outsource and then clean it up yourself into probably close to either 5,000-word articles or one 5,000-word article, because you've been talking for an hour, you've got all these experts, you've got all the sources. Repurposing that into written content can turn into maybe 5 to 10 different blog posts. And then from there, all of a sudden you've got a post a day that you can then, and then that post can turn into 5 different social media posts. All of a sudden you've just generated from one 1-hour webinar 25 pieces of content, and you can keep it going there. What we've done is whenever we post something to YouTube as an association, I can earmark it as a podcast, and it automatically goes to our Apple iTunes feed. It goes to the Google Play feed, and I've already got it set so it goes to maybe 6 or 7 different podcast feeds, all automatically. And so people can do that when you're a staff of one. But I think the single most important thing to do when you are a small staff is the prioritizing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would also add to that, the beauty of this group of State Restaurant Association executives and the associations themselves is the ability and willingness to share information. So while it's Washington State specific, okay, but if there's some information on PPP or how you communicate on grassroots advocacy, they all share examples with each other. So then you're able to kind of repackage that to use. I love Lex's uses of repackaging information. So
yeah.
Well, I think we're close to our half hour. Andy, any final thoughts?
No, I think if we were talking closer to my world, I would probably have something that was more germane to the flow of conversation. But I would like to hear what you and Suzanne have to say. I think that we're talking a lot about how the associations can support the industry in better ways in part by supporting themselves. But I kind of feel like there's probably a couple details of relevancy that we kind of had to skip over. So I'd like to see if there's an opportunity to touch base on those.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I'd say keep moving forward. Everybody's getting ready for more openings, and that is the most exciting news that we have. So that means planning for your business, looking at your inventory, working with your providers, your suppliers, and communicating out to your membership. Because we become these trusted advisors, they're looking to the state restaurant associations. What do you see us in the opening and what's going on there? So continuing that strong voice and pushing forward for these openings and then communicating it out. And wear your mask and get your vaccination if you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, no, there was one thought that just came into my head, if that's okay. I think that something that a lot of people should be getting ready for across this country is the paradigm shift in labor. If we do go to a new federal minimum wage, which is likely, I think that we experienced it here in Washington already, and it's forcing most people to reinvent everything. So as you're already doing more with less people, maybe start getting used to that and seeing how you can push that forward through time, because you're going to have to soon.
Yeah, and if you're a state that this could be devastating for a lot of states, but you can prosper still, because we've done it here in Washington State for what, Andy, for maybe a handful of years now, where we have a higher minimum wage than the rest of the country significantly, and we don't have a tip credit.
Right.
We've never had a tip credit here. So, lemons in a lemonade, try to think of the positive thing on that. And for me, in terms of this time with, changing the times, it's really important to prioritize as much as possible your information and what you're doing as an association. I think that there's so many directions that one can get taken at this time, and the smaller the staff, that prioritizing is even more important. And I think when you do that, I think you can focus your efforts and you can do more, and people will notice you more because you're going to be focusing more on better quality and things that are more relevant to them. So priority, I think, is key in this day and age, because there's so many things to take your eye off the ball on.
Agreed. I think the attention economy is probably the scarcest economy, and you've just got to stick with what you can do, and so you can focus on what you need to do.
And Suzanne, I know that there's a webinar that we're going to be doing next week on.
We are.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
I do. It's we've got a webinar on hybrid events and how to. So Alexa's actually a speaker on there, and it's really an opportunity for these states to take advantage of this virtual world that we're in, and how they can provide content to their members virtually and or via hybrid events. It's in this changing world. That's what a number of people are using for the first quarter or first half of the year. And so we're giving the how-tos on that. It's February 9th at 3 p.m. Eastern time.
Right. Okay, well, with that, thank you everybody for your time, and we'll talk to you all again next week.
All right. Have a great weekend. Thanks
See you,
for
Alex.
playing. Bye.